Hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff, and I'm joined today by Jared Nelson and a special guest. But before we get to that, just want to remind y'all where we're at. We're taking a little slower time this summer, coming out every couple weeks and spending some time talking to gentlemen from other denominations about their annual meetings. We've met with an elder from the ARP last time. And this week, we're going to delve into the world of the EPC, and I'll let our guest explain that and what that is and everything in just a few minutes. But we're glad to welcome Dustin Jernigan to the show today. Dustin, thank you for joining us. We're glad to have you. Maybe give our listeners just a glimpse into who you are real quick before we jump into all the details.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate it. My name's Dustin. I did my MDiv at RTS Jackson. I will, Lord willing, graduate with my DMin from Beeson in December. I am the last of the DMin students at Beeson. I did such a poor job that they decided to cancel the whole program after I graduated in December. Yeah, they've switched to a PhD program now. I pastor a medium-sized church out in Oregon. You may have vaguely heard of parts of Oregon and Northern California in the last few years, always trying to break off and form its own state called the state of Jefferson. And so I'm sort of in the heartbeat of that region of the country. It's, yes, it's Southern Oregon, but really it's the state of Jefferson, and Bigfoot is our mascot. And our daydream is that we are our own 51st state. So I always try to compare it to we're the red part of California and Oregon, but we're not Republicans. We're more like libertarians, if that makes sense. Libertarians who smoke weed probably would be maybe a funny way of putting it. So I'm a son of the South. Most of my family's from Alabama, but I am doing ministry here in the Pacific Northwest and have been for 6 years. And happily married to my wife, Caroline, and we are expecting baby number 6 in August.
Woo. Love it. When did you graduate from RTS Jackson?
Yeah, I chipped away for several years, working on basically my last 30 to 35 hours. So I was trying to get to all like 8 campuses. I made it to 6 eventually for my last 30. And I graduated in 2015.
Okay.
And so it took me about 8 years to get my MDiv, which is hilarious because my key memory of going to RTS for the first time was I sat next to a PCA guy who's now pastoring in Huntsville. And I said, hey, how long have you been going to seminary? And he said, this is my 8th year. And I remember rolling my eyes and thinking, I will never take 8 years to graduate from seminary. And yet here I am.
Well, that might be where we overlapped. I finished at Jackson in 2013.
Oh, nice.
Maybe
nice.
That's what it was. But we're trying to get Jared inducted into RTS, or maybe get Dallas inducted into RTS. I don't know what Scott's game is, but we like to let Jared feel alone, but also included in his seminary education. Jared's here, by the way. There he is. There
I
am. Dustin, what's the EPC? And I don't know, you've been around the Southern world. Like, maybe if you're able to give us a comparison to the PCA a little bit for most of our listeners who are in the PCA, can you kind of help them make the connection?
Yeah. So you guys have a podcast on church government. So I would imagine most of your listeners are probably vaguely familiar with Presbyterian church history. So there's always been factions or, differences in the Presbyterian church, right? There were the old lights and the new lights. There were the Northern Presbyterians and the Southern Presbyterians. Then there's sort of the evangelical wing within the Presbyterian church. And the EPC really comes out of the Northern Presbyterian church. And we are the evangelical Orthodox Presbyterians. The PCA, I think y'all started splitting off around the 60s. Is that correct? Is that when the PCA was formed?
Yeah, 73.
73.
Yeah.
73. Yeah. So, you have to look at, some of these church plants within the broader context of American history, I think. And, the North-South divide is real, not determinative, but there is a sense, I think where that plays a part socially, politically, mentality wise. And so there were a lot of Orthodox, godly Presbyterian churches that for various reasons didn't split off with the PCA or the OPC. who's to say what their reasoning was? Maybe they thought they could preserve, what they had. But eventually, what happened in 1981 is the EPC was formed, and it actually stems from a Belhaven professor, Wynn Kenyon. Did you ever have him when you were at Belhaven?
I loved Win Kenyon, man.
Yeah, so that's a story that plays large in the EPC ethos and culture because he was forbidden from being ordained in the Northern Presbyterian Church because he would not affirm, proactively, I guess, women's ordination. He said he would serve alongside women officers, but did not support it personally. Well, he didn't get ordained, and he was never an ordained minister. And that was really the impetus for a lot of the sort of theologically conservative, right-leaning Presbyterians up north to say, that's it. Around the same time, another guy was ordained, I think around Pittsburgh, actually, Jared. It's my recollection, it was in Pennsylvania or somewhere up north. And he denied something crazy like the bodily resurrection of Christ. And he was ordained. And so, you get this group of, guys in the Northern Presbyterian Church, and we're like, okay, so we won't ordain this guy, but this guy just denied like something fundamental to Orthodox faith. And so they start the EPC, which stands for the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. And the real difference, I guess, where we land is we would fall within the New Light Presbyterians, which I believe the PCA has its roots in the Old Light, or would be more sympathetic to that. The EPC is more broadly evangelical than it is like totally reformed. And then the two most famous things are that we allow each church and presbytery to decide the issue of women's ordination. And then the other issue is we allow each congregation to decide what they believe about the charismatic movement. And so the story goes that one of the founders of the EPC was a very liberal Presbyterian living up north and persecuted the conservative Orthodox guys. And then he had the baptism of the Holy Spirit, private prayer language, all that, becomes an Orthodox Bible-believing evangelical. He goes to the PCA and says, hey, I'm no longer a liberal. Can you guys let me in? Oh, by the way, I'm a charismatic. And they were like, yeah, no. And so that was another one of those sort of founding things. I would say the interesting thing about that is the charismatic bent to the EPC. I've been in the EPC, I think I started in 2011 and I was ordained in 2015. There are not a lot of like charismatic Presbyterians in the EPC yet. I'm not saying they don't exist, but we're a Presbyterian denomination. That just is not a major ethos. I would say more of the ethos, honestly, is just we're not strict cessationists. That's probably more where the EPC is. It's just we don't talk about it a lot. We're not going to argue about it. And, it's not like we're out there running around with like Bethel and wanting to sing Bethel songs. Most of us would be deeply worried about that. It's just that we don't find the cessationist argument totally compelling. The women's ordination thing, that's probably the most contentious thing, which technically each presbytery decides if they're going to ordain women pastors, and each congregation decides whether or not they want to call women as ruling elders and deacons. And so since I've been in the EPC, really historically, the EPC was predominantly a complementarian denomination with a few egalitarians. And over time, that has completely shifted. And, as a complementarian, I look at our denomination and it's functionally egalitarian, and it's increasingly so, to where every year we lose several prominent complementarian leaning churches. And so, that kind of dips into General Assembly a little bit, but that's probably the best primer on the EPC. We're not as reformed as the PCA is going to be. The officers are expected to hold to the Westminster Confession. We do not have a book of confessions. We are Westminster confession only. And a lot of them are ex-PC USA churches who are Orthodox in the fundamentals of the faith.
Yeah, and I think that's why we have some relations with the EPC. I think occasionally we'll have a delegate that will come to our General Assembly, but we're not in NAPARC together. So that would be something of a difference there between the two of them. And one other thing I wonder about, because I don't know a lot about the polity of the EPC, is So if you're familiar with the OPC, they have a delegated assembly. Their presbyteries elect some delegates to go to their general assembly. PCA, if you're a teaching elder and you can get there and pay the fee, you can be there along with ruling elders from the churches, at least two. What does it look like for the EPC in their general assembly? Is it more towards a delegated, more towards just open, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So the EPC, they're coming out of the PC USA, so they still got those scars, and I don't know if you want to use a modern term, the trauma, right, of coming out of the PC USA, and so
this is the same
actually,
place, yes.
so I would say actually the Book of Order says that in the presbytery meetings and in the General Assembly, the goal is actually 2 ruling elders for every teaching elder, and that is the case for presbytery. That at our church we have 3 pastors, me, my assistant pastor, and then a part-time assistant pastor. So we are, every presbytery, supposed to send the 3 of us plus 2 ruling elders per teaching elder. Wow. And when it comes to General Assembly, the same thing holds true. Every teaching elder is supposed to be at General Assembly, and you are supposed to bring with you 2 ruling elders. Now, whether or not that happens, I don't think it really happens. But that's baked into our Constitution because, going back to the liberalization of the PC USA, those founding guys like Andy Jumper at Central Pres and the guy at Ward Church up in Detroit, they felt like they lost the PC USA and the Presbyterian Church went astray because of teaching elders, that it was the liberalization of seminaries, and it was a clergy-led revolt against orthodoxy. And their theory was, if you actually empowered the ruling elders are going to be the people who hold the denomination accountable better than the liberalized clergy. So technically that's what we say. That's the goal. We talk about it every presbytery, in our presbytery review, we get those numbers like, hey, everybody, like, we didn't send enough ruling elders, don't forget, this is what we said we would do. I don't know what the breakdown is at General Assembly, but we strive to be a ruling elder empowering denomination.
Jared, I think we've got an overture for our GA next year that we need to write. Something similar to that. Because there's plenty of us in the PCA that are going to agree with that sentiment you just expressed about ruling elders sort of leading the direction in the conservative, more complementarian, conservative, whatever direction you might call it. And we've seen that in our own denomination over the last 5 or 10 years of the movement. As ruling elders have increased in our assembly numbers, we've seen better directions, better movement in the long run. Yeah, Jared, go ahead.
Just thinking about this year, you attended GA, and so could you tell us a little bit about what are you guys covering at GA? What are some of the big things that you're going into GA knowing these are some of the big things that we're going to be talking about? What did the EPC have on its radar to tackle this year?
I've been going to GA since 2014, and Ligon Duncan, who comes off and on to the GA, he always says the same joke. I love coming to the EPC General Assembly because you guys are the nice Presbyterians. And that stems back to, like, a lot of us, come out of the PC USA, or we were leaving places where evangelical faith was maligned and ridiculed. And so you've got to kind of, I think, place yourself in that situation to where, imagine, you're being laughed at the presbytery floor for espousing the biblical sexual ethic or the inerrancy of Scripture. And now, after probably hundreds of thousands of dollars have been handed over to your former denomination so you can just leave, you're now finally in a group of people who love Jesus and want to adhere to the Word of God. And so the longtime ethos of the EPC is like, thank God we've left Egypt. Like, we're out, and like, I don't have to distrust the people around me. I'm just so thankful they love Jesus, and we've all gotten out of it together. And so that ethos of unity in the essentials, liberty and non-essentials, and charity in all things is very much like, that's literally the motto for the EPC. So we're unified in the fundamentals of the faith. When things come that are non-salvific, charismatic stuff, women's leadership stuff, that's not essential, We're not going to persecute you over those things, but the ethos is charity and everything. So we're going to be nice, right? We're going to be loving. I don't know if it's coming out of, the last few years or the political climate or whatever, but this General Assembly was unlike any General Assembly I've ever been to. And everyone I've known has said the same thing. It was very contentious at times. It was very awkward at times. It was painful at times. And there are several things that we are just not equipped to handle. I think we're not equipped to handle as the EPC, because most of the time we get a GA, like there's no business. Like we actually don't even call it our General Assembly now. It's called the General Assembly and Gospel Priorities Summit. So it's more about leadership training around our 4 priorities of church planting, biblical leadership, world missions, and something I forgot. I don't know. We've got these things we're supposed to be focusing on every year. And so we get these talks and we get these trainings, and you would not know it's a group of Reformed Presbyterians at all. It would feel like a non-denominational leadership summit. But then, we have to tack on like a couple of hours of business. Normally it's very boring and we don't do anything. And this year we had several things that were very, very hard for us to work through. And when you never use a muscle, and then all of a sudden you're asked to like lift 200 pounds, you're like, oh snap, all of my bad habits are mounting upon me. So those struggling things are our stated clerk was in his first 3 years, and he's a very nice man. I'm sure he's a very godly man, probably more godly than me. But last year he jokingly referred to himself as our bishop from the General Assembly floor. And he uses the title president and CEO very liberally when describing his role. So that was concerning. And so we had to vote for his reelection. So that was awkward and painful at points. The EPC, since George Floyd's passing, has been painfully working on a pastoral letter on racial lament and hope. And you can imagine how dicey that is. And the committee that's been working on it had been working on it for about 2 years, and they sent out a provisional document several months ago, probably 3 months ago. And then every presbytery had time to talk about it. And there were a lot of concerns that baked into that paper were elements of critical theory. The assumptions of critical theory were also several of the assumptions in the paper. And so since it was propagated to the presbyteries, it's been edited significantly. I think a third of it has now been removed. But we also talked about approving that, which we did at General Assembly, but not without a lot of consternation and discussion about the language and the assumptions baked into our statement on racism.
So on that, did you have, was it something where people were more satisfied by the time it got to the floor and had been edited than what it had originally been?
Yes.
Or was it still something that had a lot of controversy around it?
Both of those things. So I don't know if the PCA does this. We have 2 things. The EPC doesn't do a lot, but we do 2 things. We have position papers, which could be less than a page to like 15 pages. And it is a public document that you can download on the EPC website. And it is like, what is our position on euthanasia? Or what is our position on abortion? And we're like, we are pro-life, and here's what we think. And fascinatingly, it gets into IVF at the end of it, which is wonderful. But the position paper famously on like women's ordination is less than a page long. And it basically says Christians who love Jesus can agree to disagree. And that's our position on it. It's not a justification of that. It is a public facing, here's where we stand on any number of these issues. Then internally in the denomination, we have another set of resources called pastoral letters, which are inward facing papers that only teaching and ruling elders can get access to. And so we have a public statement on biblical sexuality that we reaffirmed in 2017, which I think both of you would be very comfortable with. But then we also have a pastoral letter on sexuality, which is like 70 pages long, which is like, okay, how do you put this into practice as a church leader? Or you could hand it to your ruling elder and say, okay, well, since we're holding to the biblical sexual ethic, what does that look like in practicality? It's much longer. So the racial letter is not a public document. It is meant to be a training guide for our teaching and ruling elders. There was a lot of consternation about the letter everyone agrees that the revision is much better. Nobody denies that. Everybody's like, yes, you took out all the things that were really bothering us, but there still was very heated discussion at the GA about this document. And that's what's different about this GA, because we never do anything in our business meetings of consequence. Even when we pass the like pastoral letter and the position paper on sexuality, everyone's like, duh, yeah, this is what we agree with. Like, does anyone disagree? And it's like crickets. Well, this year, you've got the guys lined up to speak for and against it. And so we passed it. But that was contentious, I would say. And everybody would be able to say that was a test of the bonds of the EPC. And the other, probably the big thing you should probably be aware of is Memorial Press has been attempting to get into the EPC. So thanks, guys. Appreciate that.
They're not one of ours anymore. So
yeah. That scene in The Force Awakens, when Kylo Ren sees Darth Vader and he's like, I will finish what you started. There are definitely some guys in the EPC looking at y'all that same way. Like, it's time to finish what the PCA started. Memorial, from what I understand, from reputable people, they sent observers to last General Assembly. They've been observing the Presbytery of Mid-America, which is the St. Louis Presbytery, for at least the past few meetings. And they have petitioned to join the EPC. So what happened is the St. Louis Presbytery appealed to the denomination and said, can you please answer all of these questions about biblical anthropology, self-identification? At what level can a presbytery or a denomination tell a church how to use its facility if we're uncomfortable with the chapel? Can we actually, mandate a church not use their facility in such a way? And what do we think about progressive sanctification? And how much should somebody be able to identify by sin patterns? And basically, my impression is the St. Louis Presbytery, at least a significant chunk, want to let Memorial in. Not everybody, I'm sure, but there's enough people that they want to let Memorial into the EPC. But thankfully, the GOES guys, it's a complementarian presbytery, and you might be interested to know that. The St. Louis Presbytery is all complementarian. In fact, the founding EPC church, Central in Clayton, Missouri, where I used to serve, they don't even have female deacons, at least not when I was there. So this complementarian presbytery is thinking about letting in Memorial, but they know that would be very contentious. And so they've appealed to the General Assembly, and they've asked for our theology committee and our ministerial vocation committee to basically speak into this. So what happens in that, though, is several of us are deeply worried about Memorial getting in. And so another presbytery, New River, in, I think, Virginia or maybe North Carolina, somewhere back east, they make an overture to amend the Book of Order for the EPC to say that if you identify as homosexual, in that self-identification, you cannot be an officer in the EPC, whether deacon, elder, or pastor. If you continue to identify as homosexual or same-sex attracted, you may not be ordained in our denomination. So they make that overture, and then
the language seemed to be very similar to one that the PCA had in the past.
Yeah. So this presbytery overtures the GA and says, basically, we need to preemptively shut the door on Memorial getting in. Let's amend the Book of Order. Let's clarify. We don't need to study this. We have a statement on sexuality we just released in 2017. We have a 70-page pastoral letter on this. The EPC has been clear on this for 44 years. We don't want anything to do with this. Well, the Mid-America group, they appeal their own two overtures, to kick it to theology and ministerial committee, basically like, let's send this to committee for a couple of years. Well, then I think 5 other presbyteries, when they hear about the New River overture, they send their own overtures to kick it to committee. So now there's like 2 groups, at work. One group says, we need to nuance this. This is a nuanced topic. Let's kick it to committee and think about it. And then the other group is like, no, we don't need to go to committee. This is pretty clear. The answer is no. Let's amend the book of order. Let's just do it now. Well, the commissioner's handbook is released, and there are 11 pages in our commissioner handbook from Mid-America basically arguing their case to every commissioner why it should go to committee, that it's a complicated issue and stuff. So it feels very much like the GA office and most presbyteries want this to go to committee. The resistance is like, no, we don't need this to go to committee. Let's just solve it right now. They feel like they are not being given a fair shot to make this case. And there's all this discussion now going on within the denomination that we are not going to have that discussion from the General Assembly floor, that before anyone can talk about it at the GA, somehow they're going to silence that overture and not allow the GA to speak. So some guys write an open letter basically arguing for why we should not let memorial in. And it's an Old Testament, New Testament exegetical work, followed by the history of the Presbyterian Church, followed by some thoughts about practicalities and memorial. So hundreds of EPC people, ruling elders mostly and teaching elders, sign the open letter to basically counterbalance the discussion going on. Like, the side to kick it to committee seems like they've gotten a full-throated defense for why it should go to committee. And then those of us on the other side wanted to make our case. So that's all baked into this General Assembly. Are we going to talk about this or not, or is it going to get tabled to a committee?
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah.
This is fascinating. In order to change, what's required for the EPC to change their book of order? Like for us, it takes one GA plus presbyteries plus a second GA. How does it function for y'all? It's the same thing?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So the narrative is approve it at this, the argument for the New River, keep memorial out, is approve it at this GA. Then every presbytery gets to have their own discussion to either ratify or deny. And then next summer we can make the final conclusion. What we don't want, I signed the open letter, if you can't tell. I land on the other side of this. The other side is like, no, let's let our theology committee work on this and they will make a ruling, and then Mid-America can do what they want based on the permanent theology committee and based on the permanent ministerial vocation committee. That's where, the divide is. Okay, so to make matters more complicated, our previous stated clerk, a man named Jeff Jeremiah, who's from the Pacific Northwest, who was our stated clerk for the last 9 years, he's the first man to sign the open letter.
Wow.
And it's very much assumed and believed that current leadership is very sympathetic to letting memorial in. But I can't confirm that, but it seems like that's a reasonable belief. And so now it's kind of like, oh, this is getting awkward. And again, this goes back to my earlier statement. EPC is not set up to be contentious. We are set up to be really friendly with fellow Christians who love Jesus and disagree on some things, and happen to be in Presbyterian churches who, are not as reformed, but probably hardcore evangelical, good people. We're not set up. We're not trained very well in Robert's rules. We don't ever have to use them. It's like, it's like a muscle we don't ever use. Okay. So fast forward to this General Assembly. The first day, as soon as business begins, people from the New River basically presented a problem or a complaint, because when we start General Assembly, what we're told is that our permanent judicial commission has ruled that we're not going to talk about the New River Overture, but that's just going to automatically go to the standing committees. And as soon as that's declared, I don't think the PCA has a permanent judicial commission. Do you guys have that?
We do, but they don't tell us what we can talk about at GA.
Yeah. Yes. So our permanent judicial commission also does not dictate what's talked about from the GA floor. And so, there's about 5 people in the room who know what's going on, and they're like, this is not okay. You can't, the PJC cannot say that we can't talk about it. It is not their job to refer things to committees. That's the job of the General Assembly, to refer to committee, not. And it was a 5-4 split on whether or not. So some guy gets up there and he's like, look, 9 people should not dictate what the GA talks about. Well, the leadership basically overrules that statement. And so the first day of business is very awkward because they're just basically shut down, and we changed the order of some things, and we reelect our moderator on the first day, when historically it's reserved for the last day of the General Assembly. And so that was the first day. Second day of the General Assembly, when it comes to the business meeting, after all of the trainings and stuff, second day, as soon as business begins, the former stated clerk walks directly to the microphone and says, I have a complaint, issue. What happened yesterday was unconstitutional. The PJC does not have the constitutional right to kick this to committee. That needs to be something, basically he's trying to say we need to talk about it from the GA floor. The moderator does not sustain that complaint. And, you can actually, all these videos are on YouTube. Do you guys put your General Assembly on YouTube? Do you live stream this?
There. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So people can watch this. So, when our former stated clerk's complaint is not sustained, I think he was shocked. I think it's an understatement. And, essentially he appeals to the floor. And so now it's like, okay, do we want to let Jeff talk about this unconstitutional thing? And he says he has a solution, or do we just want to shut this down? So it's a voice vote. Speaking as someone who is voting in favor of Jeff's concern, I felt like we pretty clearly won the voice vote, but the moderator calls it in his own favor against Jeff. And so then, of course, 50 guys start shouting, call for the count. And so then we have to vote by standing up, and the majority actually vote with Jeff. So then we do sustain, we don't sustain the guy's other non-sustainment or whatever the Roberts rule is for there. So Jeff gets to basically lay out why it was unconstitutional and then what the solution is. Shockingly, and this is probably where the GA turned, the current stated clerk approaches for a point of privilege, and he says, I agree with Jeff. And he says, I like Jeff's solution, and this was not okay, and the PJC needs to fix this, and we will agree with Jeff. And so, but those 5 minutes between those two things happening, I mean, it's like watching mom and dad fight. You're like, okay, what's going on? Like, how do I get out of this? This is so awkward. And it's the EPC. We're the nice ones. Mom and dad don't fight. Okay. So basically that's Wednesday night. So Thursday, we're gearing up to talk about the racial lament and hope paper, and we're gearing up to talk about the New River overtures, plus all like the 6 or 7 other overtures against the New River overture, right? So we're all gearing up for Thursday when we talk about memorial and the racial letter. The racial letter passes, although it was contentious, but the real discussion happens. The last item on the docket, basically Thursday, is, okay, what are we going to do about memorial? Are we going to talk from the General Assembly floor, or is this going to get kicked to committee? When the standing committee chair comes up to talk about the recommendations about these issues, basically what she announces is that Wednesday night, some members from New River Presbytery, including one of the guys who wrote the open letter of concern, met with some people from St. Louis's Presbytery, and they formed a coalition committee that will study this issue for the next 2 years and present their findings. But for the next 2 years, there is a General Assembly will of the GA that no church ordain a same-sex attracted, identifying as such, not, I know that language is important, but if you identify in that way, you cannot be ordained in the EPC for the next 2 years. No churches to touch this for 2 years until the committee gives a resolution. And so basically that's the alternative motion. And they list out all 9 people that are going to be on that committee, including somebody from New Rivers, a couple of people from Mid-America, and then, a couple other people to kind of fill out the committee. And so everyone cheers, and it's like the culture of the EPC won. See, we are still nice. And so it passes overwhelmingly, and that motion dismisses all of the other overtures from the other presbyteries. So that's where we stand. So there's a 2-year will of the EPC that we don't agree if you continue to identify as gay and a Christian, that is appropriate for an officer, that there are some issues with self-identification we're uncomfortable with. But technically, the actual resolution is now pending for 2 years.
Yeah, it sounds like it's not so much that you solved it, but you delayed having to talk about it for a couple of years. So
you could put it that way. Or we're going to talk about it for several years while we try to figure this out.
Yeah. So does that mean y'all won't receive memorial for the time being?
No, we can't. Right. Yeah, and St. Louis, was like, they're very happy with that. They're like, yeah, we'll go back and say, hey, we can't even make a call on this for at least 2 years. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the question. And then there's disagreement in the EPC over that. There is, there are churches that want them in, and there are churches who don't. So I don't know where we're going to be in 2 years. So it'll be very, very interesting.
Yeah, there's an interesting lesson there, I think. Just if you try to avoid discussion and debate, it doesn't necessarily make it better. As somebody that is somewhat conflict avoidance driven sometimes, it's not always the best thing to avoid the conflict as much as to actually have the debate, or it spills over into outside of the court. And even if it's awkward, I think it's much better to have those debates and discussions in the court rather than say you can't have them there. Well, they're going to happen. They're just not going to be in a place where you're actually face to face talking with the person across from you.
Yeah. We're the EPC is in an interesting place. So yeah, we'll see. Well,
that seems to be some of the things that are challenging right now in the EPC, and definitely areas for people to pray about. Anything that you're from the meeting that was probably taking up a lot of the oxygen, but anything that you were particularly encouraged about happening in the EPC right now?
Yeah, I would say two things. I would say first off, it's very exciting to see us see more Black church plants and people of color pastoring. I would say that's been an emphasis, is trying to diversify. So that's sweet. It's encouraging. It's encouraging to see it. I come from the South, and that's a wound some of us carry, and so that's encouraging. It just is. It's sweet to see. The church that was hosting it.
I was just going to ask, has that been an active trying to recruit people to do church plants and things like that, or has that been more of just more people have been interested in planting it in the EPC, or both?
I don't know. I would venture to say that it is a thing that leadership feels like is important to pursue. And our biggest EPC church is Hope in Memphis, which is pastored by Rufus, wonderful African-American man. And he has recruited several church planters to plant around Memphis. And I think the General Assembly office sees that as, this is great. And I would venture to say that the leadership pipeline for the EPC has grounded to a halt. And, we're in this awkward tension of needing officers and pastors to be able to pass pretty rigorous ordination requirements and to subscribe to the Westminster Confession, but also be okay with potentially seeing female teaching elders and charismatics at your presbytery. And so there's just not a lot of people who, that's their thing. So we're struggling, I think, in some leadership capacity. So this might be a beautiful answer to that. The other thing I would say that is encouraging is there was an overture to amend the Book of Order to grant sessions the authority to commune baptized children and adults with intellectual disabilities in the case that they can't verbally profess faith. And so, what do you do with an autistic guy who can't verbally profess faith? Well, the way our book of order read right now, like you can baptize them, but you couldn't commune them because there's no verbal profession of faith. And so the GA hemmed and hawed about it, and they ultimately voted no, probably because people are concerned that you have to verbally profess faith in Christ to be able to take communion. But the other group said no to that overture because I think they would say, well, sessions can already do that if they so choose. That's the session's right. In lieu of that, what I was encouraged by was we commissioned another pastoral letter on how to respond to disabilities and the ministry. And it's to be a pervasive guide on developing disabilities ministries in the EPC. And that would be an internal facing document, but it would be available to every teaching and ruling elder. Hey, okay, if you don't want to commune this person, well, how do you become, autistic friendly as a church? Or what do you do with the special needs ministry? And the PCA, you guys do a great job with that. You've got your own little disability ministry thing. You've got Enfold. So that's encouraging. That's near and dear to my heart. I have a autistic and severely disabled son. So anything that we do to kind of move the ball closer to making room for people with disabilities, I'm all for. And I think the Reformed faith has a beautiful answer to people like that it's in God's providence and it's not a mistake. And, God makes the blind, the seeing, and the lame. So that's encouraging things. So the disabilities pastoral letter would be cool. But I mean, in general, it was a hard General Assembly for us where, we're just, I don't know how thick of an institution we are. And these are pretty high level, high trust kind of things. And like you said, there's a lot of the oxygen is taken up out of the room.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to follow up on that, Ben, before I ask some of the last two questions?
No, keep going.
Okay. Did you guys have a PCA fraternal or corresponding delegate at your General Assembly?
Yes, we did. I think his name was Ed Norton. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in thinking through your experience at GA, and I don't know exactly how well you know the PCA, is there any parting words that you wanted to pass along to PCA brothers who might be listening, either encouragements or what we should be doing from our perspective that might be of aid to the EPC or in prayer for them?
Yeah, I mean, I would appreciate any prayer about the memorial thing. I think there's a lot of teaching elders who are just ignorant. Not in a bad way. I just mean like it's not on their radar to think about memorial stuff and what went on there. So if you have friends in the EPC, maybe call them and share your thoughts on this. We want to get it right. And it seems there does seem to be some complexity. It's my understanding that he was exonerated by his presbytery. Is that you all's understanding? When he was, investigated or something. So
if you want some of our history of it, it gets a bit complicated, but there was at least one case in which it ended with, in a sense, an acquittal of what the presbytery had done in that case. Although I think there's some resources with the PCA sexuality report that I think are helpful for some of the issues. Our own presbytery wrote a report, or committee did, that reviewed his book, Time to Care, and had some concerns about the compatibility of that book with our confession in about 5 different points. So there was things like that were kind of bubbling in the background when they left. So the question is, if they hadn't left, would there have been something else that was on the horizon? But that's kind of what if history there.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, that would be helpful. Just all the information, if there's guys in the PCA around the country, if you've got a local EPC guy, maybe pick up the phone or email them and just chat about that. I would just pray for the EPC. I think we are in a decisive moment where what does it mean when we say unity in the essentials, liberty and non-essentials? Like how much of a tool is that when it comes to some of these other topics, and how do you square that with a confessional church? There's just inherent tension baked in that.
It becomes difficult who defines what the things that you can have liberty on are. And at least in my book, sanctification is part of the gospel too.
Yeah. Well, it's just, we had another discussion about baptism and communion. There was an overture to amend the book of worship to clarify that ministers may invite baptized believers to partake of communion. And that's implied in our book of worship. We have a book of worship that's actually constitutional. Wouldn't that be fun for you guys?
There you
It is stated that the session may admit baptized children to the table upon profession of faith and all that stuff, but it doesn't speak to baptized adults. And so this was an attempt to align our book of worship so that, ministers can invite all baptized believers in Jesus' name. And we saw it as a, wonderful teaching opportunity. If baptism is truly the replacement of circumcision, it only makes sense, right, to see baptism as the initiation rite, so to speak, and for communion to be the renewal of the covenant. Well, that got shut down easily 70-30. And the kinds of arguments that people made against clarifying that, to me, were surprising. And it just reminded me that, like, either we're not totally reformed or we're not so total tied to the confession, or people just haven't ever thought about it and they're just like saying what they think off the cuff. So whether you land on that, I think probably have y'all been in the room and you heard the kinds of arguments that people would make. It would be like, that's not how Reformed people think. It's like, but there's no Bible verse. And I'm like, yeah, but you can derive things by good and necessary consequence. I wanted to stand up at one point and be like, then why do you baptize children? Why do you baptize infants? You do it because by good and necessary consequence and a covenantal understanding of how the old covenant and the new covenant interacted. So anyway, so that was, I'm off on a tangent again, but I'm still recovering from this General Assembly, but all that to say, I guess that would be I would say the EPC is in flux, and we're going through our identity crisis, and it's a little bit like, what does unite our denomination? It doesn't really seem to be a robust Reformed theology, and there are several instances where we're not unified on stuff like memorial or the sacraments. The racial letter. So, like, what is uniting all of these churches? And then simmering under the surface, of course, is the complementarian egalitarian divide. Like, okay, is this tenable? How tenable is this compromise? And I'll leave it to the Presbyterian historians to project as to what will become of the EPC in the next 10 or 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if Jared's finished, I have, before I close this down, I've got one more question.
Okay.
How many food-based social events do y'all have at the EPC General Assembly? Specifically anything focused around ice cream.
Oh, okay. So, seminaries come, they'll do like their special breakfast thing. And then during lunch, we have breakout lunches, which is more training. And so, you come, you get your little box lunch, and then there's like, 10 or 15 little training seminars. And then there's dinner available every night. So in that sense, all of the meals, at least at GA, are all stuck together, but ours is 3 days. It's a 3-day General Assembly. So I feel like there's something embedded in an ice cream social. Maybe I didn't get invited to that. Maybe I'm on the wrong side. Do you guys have ice cream socials? Is that a thing y'all do?
That's an excellent question, Dustin. That's a question I've been trying to ask for the last 6 months. We used to. We're trying to make it come back. So I'm just always interested. I heard the OPC had one, so I'm eager to talk to somebody from that denomination.
I'm sure they had flavors from vanilla to vanilla.
I'm sure. Yeah. Oh man.
Touche.
Well, Jared, you good?
I'm good. Yeah. Thanks
Dustin,
a lot for coming on and talking to us about this. Yeah. And then
anything you want to add? Anything that's still lingering you wanted to make sure to say, or you all right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I love the EPC. Very sweet people, very godly people. I might sound too negative coming off of this GA, if that makes sense. Maybe I might sound a little too down on it, but in a lot of ways, I would plead with my PCA friends to don't forget about us. We love you guys. We wanted to be a NAPARC. NAPARC would not let us in. So there's affection from the EPC to the PCA. So, and you might meet more of us eventually.
Oh, man. Well, here, let's close down. I was trying to think of a name to use, and we're just going to use our buddy Scott. As Scott Edberg would say, this podcast is over. Thanks for joining us, dear listeners. If you're interested in learning anything more about what we've talked about, check out the show notes in your podcast player or at politymatters.org. Our many thanks to Dustin Jernigan for joining us. That D and the J.
I know.
Okay, sorry.
It gets everybody.
Anyway, Dustin Jernigan.
Yeah.
There he is. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider following us on Twitter or Facebook at Polity Matters, and be sure to subscribe in your podcast app of choice. If you have questions or comments, you can contact us at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com or find us on social media. Be sure to check out show notes for the proper links. Thanks again for spending your valuable time with us. Until next time, say goodbye, gentlemen.
Goodbye.
See you guys.
Y'all take care.